Hi guys, welcome to this channel. If you are new here, this is Styles by Sienna and my name is Atinuke. On this channel, we do a lot about sewing tutorial. So if this is something that interests you, kindly subscribe to this channel to enjoy more content. For returning subscribers, thank you so much for subscribing. I really appreciate you. So today we are going to be making a tutorial on how to cut and sew a simple pencil gown with slits at the back. So if this is something that interests you, please stay till the end of the tutorial. Thank you. So these are all the material we need for this tutorial. Our fabric is here, then all our curves, as well as scissors, tape rule, and our pins. So without further ado, let's dive straight into it. So guys, I folded my fabric into four and I used the largest part of the body measurement to fold it, which is the hip side. So that part I'm touching now is the center front and center back. So now I'm just going to go ahead now and mark the zipper allowance. So the zipper allowance that I'm going to be using is 1.5 inches. So I'm just going to mark 1.5 inch from the beginning of the fabric all through to the end of the fabric. So after marking the zipper allowance, the next thing I'm going to mark now is I'm going to mark 1 inch at the beginning, from the beginning of the fabric, and that's going to serve as our starting point. So after marking the 1 inch, I'm just going to mark out the length that we of this gown that we want to make. So the length we are going for is 40 inches, but I'm going to add 1 inch extra, which is going to serve as our hemming allowance. So that means we are going to be marking as 41 inches for this gown that we are making. So at that 41 inches, I'm just going to like make a straight line there and cut it out. So guys, I've gone ahead to cut it out and this is what we'll be working with. The next thing I'm going to do now is to fold in the zipper allowance. So guys, I've gone ahead to fold in the zipper allowance. So that part is going to be our center front and center back. So the next thing we are going to do is to mark out our shoulder measurement. And the shoulder measurement we are working with is 7.5 inches. So on that 7.5, I'm going to come down by 1 inch. So at that point that I came down by 1 inch, I'm just going to make a straight line to connect it to the shoulder line. And that's going to be our shoulder slope. So from there, I'm going to start by marking out all our vertical body measurements. So I'm going to start by marking out the bust point. The bust point we are working with is 9.5 inches. So I'm just going to go ahead and mark that out. Then I'll mark out the waist points, the waistline, which is 16 inches, and I'm going to go ahead and mark out the hip line, which is 24 inches. I will make it on the other side and connect it with a straight line. So there's the bust point, that's the waistline, and that's the hip line. So on the bust point, we are just going to come up by 1.5 inch, and that 1.5 inch that we came up with is going to serve as our chest line. So I'm just going to make a straight line at that point that we came up with now. So that's our chest line. So the next thing we are going to do is to repeat that shoulder measurement on the chest line. I mean, we are repeating the 7.5 on the chest line. So after marking it out, we are going to connect it to the shoulder line in a straight line. So once we connect it, we are going to like look for the midpoint of that line. So when we get the midpoint, we go in by 1/2 inch. Then we are going to mark our bust span measurement and just form our armhole like that. So I'm going to go ahead now to mark out the bust span measurement, and the bust span measurement I'm working with is 8¼ of an inch. Then I'm just going to go ahead now and form my armhole by connecting those points together. So I just made the front armhole. So to make the back armhole, I'm just going to use a curve to connect it to the line. So I'm not going to go inward at all for the back armhole. I'm just going to connect it straight to that line, and I've done that. So the next thing I'm going to do now is to mark out our dart line. So on the waistline, I'm going to start marking the nipple to nipple distance by divided by 2. So the nipple to nipple distance I'm using here is 7 divided by 2, that's 3.5. So I've gone ahead to mark that on the waistline, on the hip line, and on the bust point. So I'm just going to use a straight ruler to connect those 3 points together. So after connecting them on the waistline, I'm going to go in on both sides by 1/2 inch. Then on the bust point, I'm going to come down by 1 inch, and on the hip line I'm going to go up by 1 inch, and I'm just going to connect all those points together to form our darts. So after creating our dart, the next thing is to start taking our circumference measurement. So we already marked out the bust span circumference the other time, so I'm just going to add 1.5 inch to it as our seam allowance. So on the waistline, the waist circumference we are using is 24 inches divided by 4 is 6 inches. So I'm marking out 6 inches. So I'm going to add 1 inch for the dart intake, and that's what I'm adding now. After that, I'm going to add 1.5 inch for seam allowance. The hip measurement we are using is 40 divided by 4, that's 10 inches. So I'm going to mark out 10 inches now. So after marking out that 10 inches, I'm going to add 1.5 inch seam allowance to it as well. So now I'm just going to take my curve now and I'll use that curve to connect those points together. So I'm just going to use it to connect the bust point to the bust span to the waistline. Then I'll connect it to the hip line as well. So now I'm just going to go ahead and use the curve rule to taper the end of the gown. So if you want yours to be more pen than this, you can actually go ahead and do that, but this is actually okay for me. So now it's time to work on the neckline. So for the back panel, I'm going to be marking out 1.5 inch neck depth. So I'm just going to mark it out now. Then the neck width is going to be 3 inches, which is what I'm marking out now. So I'm going to connect the neck width and the neck depth together. So for the front panel, the neck depth I'm using for the front panel is 4 inches. So I'm going to mark that 4 inches, and I want it the neckline for the front panel to be like a box like neckline. So I'm just going to make it like a box. So that's that about that. The next thing is to add 1/2 inch allowance to the shoulder, and that is the allowance we are going to use to join the front shoulder to the back shoulder. So that's what I'm marking out now. So once we mark that out, I'm just going to make a straight line there. Then that's that. We are just going to cut out our outfits. So while cutting the outfit, when you get to the armhole side, you just cut the back armhole, and at the neckline you are cutting the back neckline, and that's because both the front neckline and the front armhole are deeper than that of the back. So I'm just going to go ahead now and notch the zipper allowance. Then I'll go ahead to notch the waistline so I can align them properly when it's time to sew them together. After that, I'll go ahead to separate the front panel from the back panel. So guys, I've separated the front panel from the back panel, and I've set the back panel aside. So now I'm just going to cut the armhole for the front panel. So once I'm done with that, I'll move to the neckline as well and cut the neckline for the front panel as well. So that's what I just did now. So guys, this is our front panel and this right here is our back panel. So the next thing I'm going to do now is that I'm going to go ahead to cut lining for these pieces and as well as the sleeve. So I've cut lining for these pieces, and as you can see, the lining is shorter, like 1 inch shorter than the fabric, and that's because we are going to use the lining to turn the fabric inward. So now we are going to sew the fabric and the lining together, but before we do that, to make sure that we mark out our that's on the right line, so I'm just going to go ahead now to measure the distance from the waistline to the hip line, like from the that line of the waistline to that of the hip line, and as you can see, it is 7 inches. So I'm going to take note of that. I'm going to, from the waistline down is 7 inches. So from the waistline up, we are going to measure that one as well. So, and that one is 5.5 inches. So from the waistline up is 5.5 inches, while from the waistline down is 7 inches. And we already know that from the midpoint to where our dart is 3.5 inches. So we are already taking note of that, so that when it's time to take in the dart, we not make mistake. So now the next thing is to go ahead to sew the neckline. So I'm just going to place the lining on the fabric like this and sew it. After sewing it, I'll notch it, then I'll flip it to the other side and top stitch. Then I'm going to go ahead again to place the lining on the down part of the fabric, making sure that the lining is facing the right side of the fabric. So I'm going to sew that down as well, then I'm going to turn it inside out. So guys, I've gone ahead to sew the neckline for the front panel. This is the neckline for the front panel, and I've gone ahead to do the same for the back panel. I've already hemmed the downside as well for both the two pieces of the back panel and that of the front panel. So the next thing I'm going to do now is to go ahead and sew down the lining to the fabric. Then I'm going to take in the darts. So guys, I've taken in the darts for both the front piece and the back piece, and as you can see, I've gone ahead to join the zipper allowance for the back piece as well. So after taking in the darts, I gave it a good press. So I've set aside the front panel. It's time to like mark out our slit length. So the length you want to go for depends on what you are comfortable with. But for this tutorial, I'm going to be marking out 10 inches slit length. So I'm going to mark that out from the end of the back panel to up to 10 inches. So I'm going to take it to my machine and stitch it on that line. So I'm going to be back stitching so that it will be secured properly. So after doing that, I'm going to go ahead to attach my zipper to the back piece as well. So I've attached the zipper to the back panel, and I've already stitched down the length of the slits. So the next thing I'm going to do now is just to rip open the seam from the end of the back panel down to the slit length. So if you have a seam ripper, you can use it, but I don't have a seam ripper, so that's why I'm using my hands to rip open the stitches that I used to sew down the back panel. So after removing the stitches, so this is our slit is already opened. So the next thing we are going to do now is to join both the front panel and the back panel together at the shoulder. So to do this, you are going to be placing both the front and the back panel on each other like this. So you will now take the lining of the back panel and use it to cover the front panel. So after doing that, I'm just going to like take it to my sewing machine now and just go ahead and sew it down on it like this. So guys, we have done that, and the method we use to join the shoulder together, make sure that the seam at the shoulder is properly hidden. So now the next thing we are going to do now is to attach our sleeve to our armhole. So to attach the sleeve, you are going to fold your sleeve into two. I've gone ahead to hem the sleeve. So you fold the sleeve into two and notch the midpoint. So you are going to place the midpoint on that joining at the shoulder. Then I'm going to go ahead now and pin it down there. So after pinning it down, I'll now take it to my machine and start sewing right from the end like that. So I'll do that for that sleeve and for the other sleeve as well. So guys, I've gone ahead to join the sleeve of this to this clothes. So now I'm just going to place the front panel and the back panel on each other. Then I'm going to pin them down to each other, making sure that they are aligned properly to each other. So after pinning them down, remember we left 1.5 inch as our seam allowance. So after pinning them down, I'm going to take it to my machine and use 1.5 inch to stitch it down as our seam allowance. Then after stitching, I will just trim off the excesses. After trimming off the excess, I'm going to turn it to the right side, give it a good press, then I'll take it to the mannequin so we can see the final look of the gown. So guys, this is the final look of our outfit. As you can see, it's sitting down right and properly on the mannequin. And I'm just going to turn it to the back now so we can see the slits. So this is how the back looks, and this right here is our slits. So thank you so much guys for watching this tutorial. Please do well to like this video and subscribe to this channel to enjoy more sewing content. I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.